Welcome to This Old Road. This is the next installment in my series on California's Great Renumbering of 1964, Episode 3, in which 17 U.S. highways were reduced down to only 7 by the time that everything was said and done. In the prior episodes, I explained the rationale behind the changes, and then I talked about the 5 routes which were eliminated completely. In this episode, I'm looking at the 4 routes which were truncated. That is to say that they were not eliminated entirely, but they were shortened from their historic extent, and in some cases quite drastically. These are the 4 highways I'll be detailing today: US 6, US 50, US 101, and US 395. Compared to its greatest length, US 6 lost 7/8 of its distance, dropping from 330 miles in 1963 down to only 40 in 1964. US 50 fared somewhat better, being trimmed by only half, while US 101 and US 395 lost only their southernmost portions. So let's dive in, and I'll begin with US 50. In many ways, you could say that US 50 didn't really look any different after the Great Renumbering than it did back in 1930. Back in the earliest days of the U.S. highway system, US 50 went no further west than Sacramento. But in the early 1930s, US 50 was extended all the way to San Francisco, and that was accomplished as a replacement for US 48, which was the first of the original highways to be eliminated. So in 1964, all they really did was pare US 50 back to where it had ended originally. In its heyday, US 50 was a coast-to-coast route from the eastern shore of Maryland to San Francisco. In California, the route ran from the state line at South Lake Tahoe over Echo Summit and down into Sacramento. From there was a 45-mile concurrency with US 99 down to Stockton, where US 50 then broke away and climbed over Altamont Pass to the East Bay and then up to Oakland. The final 8 miles into San Francisco were shared on a concurrency with US 40. In the Great Renumbering, everything east of Sacramento was spared, but west of Sacramento, US 50 got sliced and diced into a plethora of highways. Unlike so many of the other US routes that were impacted by the Great Renumbering, US 50 wasn't being replaced by an interstate. Nope. US 50 was being replaced by not 2 and not even 3 interstates. US 50 got carved up and incorporated into 4 different interstate routes. In Sacramento, US 50 would end at the junction with Highway 99, just like it had some 3 decades earlier. That concurrent section with US 99 would be converted to State Route 99, as we'll see in a future episode, but the concurrency itself would be eliminated. In Stockton, US 50 split off from 99 and crossed town along Charter Way. That street also carried State Route 4 across town, so it was easy enough to remove US 50 and just leave it as State Route 4. Leaving Stockton, US 50 began its trek on new interstate routes. First, south from Stockton to Mossdale Crossing west of Manteca, the route was usurped by the new Interstate 5. From there, to the other side of Tracy, it became Interstate 205. After that, it was the largest interstate replacement, I-580, which covered the 60 miles into Oakland, where it then met up with Interstate 80 to cross the bay into San Francisco. Substantial portions of those replacement interstate freeways were not yet constructed in 1964, so US 50 was given a short reprieve from immediate truncation, and it survived on borrowed time until the early 1970s. Here's a fun happenstance. On this official state highway map from 1963, just before the Great Renumbering, notice that this portion of US 50 from Stockton all the way to the Bay Area was designated as Legislative Route Number 5. That includes this portion up here between Lathrop and Stockton. In the post-Great Renumbering landscape, this section of US 50 ended up being replaced by Interstate 5. So, purely by chance, the highway planners were able to achieve the third objective of the Great Renumbering, which was using the same numbers on the highway shields that they use for administrative and legal definitions of state highways. So here, what became Interstate 5 was already tagged as Legislative Route Number 5. In the decades since 1964, US 50 is one of the few US routes in California which is now longer than it was in 1964. That's because 5 miles were added to the route in 1983. This lengthening of US 50 was implemented as a result of the decision to reroute Interstate 80 around the north side of Sacramento. US 50 was extended westward to absorb the prior routing of Interstate 80, which had been on the south side of downtown Sacramento, across the Sacramento River, and into Yolo County. Now, this extension represented a completely new routing for US 50 and not a revival of the historic routing, because historically, US 50 had never entered Yolo County, and it never previously crossed the Sacramento River in this area either. So today, in 2025, the west end of US 50 is located at its junction with Interstate 80 in West Sacramento. The fates of US 6 and 395 were intertwined with each other, mostly because they shared an intertwined section of 125 miles. Of all of the long concurrencies between two US routes, this one was the longest dual-sign stretch that was not slated to become an interstate. Such a lengthy shared routing meant that the architects of the Great Renumbering would have to pick one of the two routes to remove. But which one? The two routes were similar in that they both began in Southern California, and they both entered Nevada after their concurrency. US 6 began in Long Beach and US 395 down in San Diego, and the two met up in the desert near Inyokern. The two routes shared a really long concurrency all the way up the Owens Valley on the backside of the Sierra for 125 miles up to Bishop before they parted ways. Beyond Bishop, US 6 left California almost immediately, just 40 miles beyond the split. US 395 was a little bit more interesting because it left California and then re-entered the state after passing through Carson City and Reno, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. For both routes, these sections which were beyond Bishop weren't at risk at all. It was the portions of Bishop where a decision was needed. After the first episode in this series, I received comments from some people who said that they thought that US 6 should have been preserved instead of US 395 because, at the time, US 6 was the longest highway in the country. It went from coast to coast. A case could have been made for preserving either one because each of them had long sections where it was the only US route on a roadway. They also both had an incredible number of junctions and concurrencies with the other routes in Southern California, resulting in these super crowded route diagrams. But US 395 had an insurmountable advantage, and that is that it was not being replaced by an interstate. The entire distance between the Inland Empire and San Diego was served solely by US 395, and no interstate was planned. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know now that Interstate 15 extends all the way south into San Diego, but that wasn't the plan in 1964. Instead, the plan for Interstate 15 was that its southern end would be in Colton, where it met Interstate 10. Thus, US 395 couldn't be eliminated south of its concurrency with US 6 because it wasn't being replaced. Unlike US 66 and US 80, which managed to hold on for a few years after 1964, simply because the replacement interstates weren't ready in 1964, US 395 held on because there was no plan for an interstate at all. So, with these facts in mind, it was determined that US 6 would be the one to be removed south of the concurrency. Before the Great Renumbering, US 6 was the longest highway in the United States, 3,650 miles, all the way from Cape Cod in Massachusetts to Long Beach, California. Now, although it's pretty well known that the western end of US 6 was located in Long Beach, the details of this endpoint are quite a curiosity. Two curiosities, actually. First, anyone driving toward the west end of the highway actually spent the final 5 or 6 miles heading east. From downtown Los Angeles, US 6 went southward along the Harbor Freeway and Figueroa Street, all the way down to the street that we know today as Pacific Coast Highway. At that point, US 6 turned eastward toward Long Beach, sharing the road with what was then at the time known as alternate US 101. So westbound US 6 finished up by heading east. And that brings me to the second curiosity. Somewhere in Long Beach, US 6 ended, but I've never been able to pinpoint the precise location where that ending occurred. Because there was a concurrency with US 101 alternate, when US 6 ended, that concurrent route continued straight ahead. But what makes it even more nebulous is the fact that the south end of US 91 was also located in Long Beach and also on a concurrency with alternate US 101, but coming into Long Beach from the other direction. Now I believe that both US 6 and US 91 ended at the same corner in Long Beach, even though they were coming into town from opposite directions. So this means that driving along PCH here, now follow this closely, if you were driving due east back in 1963, you were following southbound US 101 alternate and westbound US 6. But at some particular corner, suddenly you found yourself driving on northbound US 91 along as southbound US 101 alternate. Again, all while headed in a true cardinal east direction and without making any turns. So somewhere along the way, US 6 ended and US 91 began. The problem is that none of the maps ever makes it clear exactly where that point was. On most maps, you simply see US 6 shields west of Long Beach and US 91 shields east of Long Beach. Now, I've read some accounts from some people who say that they remember that US 6 ended at the Los Alamitos circles, but I've never found any maps or photograph to support that contention. Dale Sanderson, who has delved into this as much as anyone I know, says that this changeover occurred at what is today the corner of Pacific Coast Highway and Atlantic, and his research is documented on his USN's website. Making the determination even trickier is the fact that the endpoint also may have moved through the years. In fact, it almost certainly did, because by 1963, this official map seems to suggest that the switch from US 6 to US 91 occurred at the Long Beach Freeway, which appears on this map shown as State Route 15, which was the number of the Long Beach Freeway back before the Great Renumbering. So that would be consistent with Dale's research too, because the Long Beach Freeway was the replacement for Atlantic Avenue. Now this whole discussion is a rabbit hole that could fill an entire video all by itself, so I'll just have to be content here to say that US 6 began or ended in Long Beach. Turning to my schematic diagram, this western strange terminus of US 6 appears on the left-hand side of the diagram, with US 91 continuing from that point where US 6 ends. North of downtown LA, US 6 joined up with both US 66 and US 99 at the stack along the route of the Pasadena Freeway. Just beyond Dodger Stadium, US 99 and US 6 left the Pasadena Freeway and went up through Glendale, Burbank, and San Fernando. On the schematic, I'm calling this point Elysian, but that's not really a name at all. This junction is within the city of Los Angeles and only a couple of miles north of downtown. But I needed a way to distinguish this point from the other junctions in LA. Essentially, Elysian is the point where the 5 and 110 freeways meet today. For most of the years, this transition off of the Pasadena Freeway occurred at Avenue 26. But the Golden State Freeway got completed in this area in the early 1960s, and US 6 and 99 were moved to that freeway just before the renumbering occurred. In fact, US 99 actually got moved away from the stack just before the renumbering, and that change reduced this triple concurrency near Dodger Stadium down to a double. In any case, there was a concurrency between US 6 and US 99 all the way up to the north end of the San Fernando Valley, where US 6 split away from US 99 at Newhall. From there, US 6 was the only US route on this road all the way up to the point where it met US 395, with the only exception being the short concurrency it shared with US 466 through Mojave. This means that since US 6 was being eliminated south or west of US 395, it would leave two significant portions of the route where a new number would be needed. South of downtown LA, and then this whole section from US 99 to US 395. South of downtown, finding a new number was easy enough because the Harbor Freeway already carried a second number along with US 6. It was also State Route 11. So US 6 could be removed here with minimal impact. That very last part, which cut back into Long Beach, was already a concurrency as well, so US 6 could be removed there without any serious pain. And that's what happened. The Harbor Freeway just became State Route 11. North of downtown, that small section near Dodger Stadium also retained the number State Route 11. Beyond that, on the dual routing with US 99, both routes ended up being replaced by Interstate 5. I'll cover US 99 in greater detail in an upcoming episode, so if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, and click on the notification bell so that you'll know when that episode is ready. That left the 210 miles from US 99 at Newhall up to the junction with 395. The number that they settled on was State Route 14. Now, I've tried to figure out the thought process that led to that decision, but I haven't really unearthed anything conclusive. Similar to the Harbor Freeway, this section of US 6 also already had a state route number. In this case, US 6 shared the road with State Highway 7, and actually, this road had been State Route 7 even before US 6 had been extended into California in the 1930s, as evidenced by this picture from Mojave. To me, it seems that the logical thing to do would have been just to repeat what they did along the Harbor Freeway and just keep this section numbered as State Route 7. But instead, curiously enough, they removed State Route 7 here also and moved it to the Long Beach Freeway, which was also in need of a new number because the Long Beach Freeway's number at the time, Route 15, would be needed for Interstate 15. So the Long Beach Freeway became California 7. But while that decision solved the problem with the Long Beach Freeway, it now meant that this stretch of old US 6 now had no numbers. So they settled on 14, which was becoming available because the corridor where 14 had existed before the Great Renumbering was getting a new number anyway. In this case, this was the alignment along Artesia Boulevard, and it would become State Route 91. Now, I haven't covered US 91 and State Route 91 in this series yet, so in order to avoid straying too far off the track, I'll save those details for the appropriate episode. Suffice to say that the number 14 was available, and so it was assigned to replace US 6. That still, however, doesn't answer the question of why they involved State Route 7 into all of this. It seems like it would have been easier just to leave 7 up here where US 6 was, and then use 14 for the Long Beach Freeway. And perhaps I'll never be able to answer that question. There is a postscript on US 6's old routing, too. In 1983, the numbering with the Harbor Freeway was changed again. So instead of State Route 11, it became Interstate 110 south of the Santa Monica Freeway and State Route 110 north of there. And that's the number that it carries today, 110. In the original plan for U.S. highways, US 395 was a relatively minor route which existed only in the state of Washington. But a decade later, 395 was expanded greatly and became a powerhouse route which stretched from the Canadian border down almost all the way to the Mexican border. At over 1,400 miles in length, it was one of the longer north-south routes and may have been the longest with a 3-digit number. Unique among California routes, US 395 had two different portions in California, separated by a section of about 80 miles in Nevada. The route left California and passed through Carson City and Reno before re-entering the Golden State near Cold Springs. While in Nevada, US 395 had a short concurrency with US 50 in Carson City, and still does today, and it intersected with US 40 in downtown Reno. Also in Reno, US 395 picked up a shared routing with Alt US 40, which it carried concurrently back into California. Those two routes split apart about only 8 miles north of the state line. In 1964, Alt US 40 was renumbered to become State Route 70 in California, and in Nevada, where it had 0 miles as a solo route, it was eliminated. So those 8 miles of dual numbering were removed. The only other junction with a U.S. highway in the northern portion of US 395 was at the eastern end of US 299 in Alturas. So once US 40 had been removed, the northern portion of US 395 had no more overlaps to worry about. All of the action for US 395 took place down south. On this diagram, you may notice that I included a US 80 shield down here by San Diego. From the time that the freeway through Balboa Park was completed in 1948, US 80 and US 395 shared a concurrency on the final 4 miles of each route from Mission Valley down into San Diego, and both ended where they met US 101. In the years leading up to the Great Renumbering, the freeway through Mission Valley was completed, and US 80 was moved onto that new freeway instead of running concurrent with US 395. So since this diagram is already overcrowded enough, I figured that just mentioning US 80 would be sufficient. Now, when I discussed the intertwined sections of US 6 and US 395 earlier, I already mentioned that 395 was not being truncated because it was not being replaced by an interstate. So, no change to the routing of US 395 occurred as a result of the Great Renumbering in 1964. Okay, folks, thanks for watching. Goodbye. But of course I jest. It is true that US 395 was not altered by the Great Renumbering per se, but big changes were set in motion in 1964. In that same year, a proposal to extend Interstate 15 down to San Diego was approved, and with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that ultimately that decision did result in a major truncation to US 395. And this is one super complicated history. Let's begin with the fact that 2 route concurrencies would have to be maintained in order to keep US 395 running all the way down to San Diego. Now remember that one of the primary goals of the Great Renumbering was to eliminate route overlaps, but in order to keep US 395 intact, it was necessary to keep it paired with other routes. The first of the concurrent section was the 30 miles it shared with Interstate 15 from Hesperia down to Colton, where those 2 routes met Interstate 10. At that point, Interstate 15 would end in 1964, while US 395 would continue ahead. Now, before 1964, there had been a concurrency with US 91 south of Colton. That could be removed on this section because US 91 was being replaced by Interstate 15, but I'll cover that one in a future episode. However, a second dual route section remained for US 395, even though it was relatively short, only 4 miles with Route 60 through Riverside. US 60 was in the process of being downgraded to a state highway route, and again, that's coming in a future episode, but this section, which was shared with US 395, would still be a part of State Route 60. So the Great Renumbering left this concurrency in place too. It just gave new shields to Route 60. From the point where 395 departed from 60 all the way down to San Diego, there were no more route overlays to contend with. However, as I mentioned, the southward extension of Interstate 15 was approved in the same year that the Great Renumbering took place, and it would have a profound impact on US 395. In the subsequent years, as the highway planners began to develop the routing for Interstate 15 down to San Diego, they applied a number of different designations to this road, which was once US 395. In the first iteration of the planning, they just decided that Interstate 15 should follow the same routing which was used by US 395. By 1970, the LRN designation had been changed to Route 15, but the official map doesn't indicate that there were any Interstate 15 shields posted down here yet. I think that just means that they were holding off while they improved the new freeway up to modern standards. But at the same time, the planners were exploring another proposal too. What if they gave Interstate 15 a brand new routing, further west, away from the congestion in the heart of San Bernardino and Riverside? They chose a corridor paralleling Milliken Avenue and Hammer Avenue along State Routes 31 and 71, which had already been included in the state's master freeway plans. In the early 1970s, they decided to make the move, as this map from 1975 represents. The route of US 395 through San Bernardino and Riverside is depicted here as Interstate 15E. Now, this does not mean that they intended to create an east and west branch of I-15. It was just that the new routing of mainline I-15 would be through Norco and Corona, while the old high would become an eastern branch. There was never a plan for an Interstate 15W, only a 15E. This scheme didn't last too long because suffix routes like 15E fell out of favor nationwide around 1980, and nearly all of them all across the country were renumbered to something else. The last time that 15E appeared on the map was 1982, and then Old 395 finally received the number that it bears today, Interstate 215. I said Old 395 there because in the middle of all of those interstate transitions, US 395 was removed from the mix and truncated to end where it does today, near Hesperia. When the new freeway for Interstate 15 was opened from Devore down to I-10, enough of the new freeway sections for Interstate 15 had been completed that the remaining sections could now be called Temp 15, so 395 could be removed, and that happened in 1976. One small piece of US 395 needs to be talked about, and that's down here in San Diego. The new Interstate 15 replaced US 395 for most of its distance in San Diego County. But south of Mira Mesa, freeway planners decided to build Interstate 15 on a more easterly course than the one which had been used by US 395. One of the main reasons for this was to avoid the historic section through Balboa Park and that beautiful, extraordinary Cabrillo Bridge, which already was a half-century old even at that time. So all of the old sections of US 395 which were south of Miramar became State Route 163. Finally, I come to US 101. This was another route which intersected with nearly every other route in the state, and the route diagram is super busy. But none of that matters because of the 4 routes featured in this video, US 101 was the simplest. US 101 would be keeping most of its mileage in the state. In fact, even now, more than 6 decades after the Great Renumbering, US 101 still has most of its original mileage intact and is still the longest US highway in the state at more than 800 miles. That means that modern-day US 101 is still about 10 miles longer than Interstate 5, even though Interstate 5 begins all the way down at the Mexican border and US 101 no longer does. Even crazier to consider is the fact that 135 of those miles, which are now part of Interstate 5, were once part of US 101, as they were the very same 135 miles which were taken away from US 101 in 1964. So before the Great Renumbering, US 101 was an even larger monster, spanning almost 950 miles in California. I can simplify the route diagram down to these 2 relevant sections, and it boils down to this simple explanation. South of downtown Los Angeles, all of US 101 was replaced by Interstate 5. And north of downtown LA, the designation of US 101 was retained. US 101 was being upgraded to modern freeway standards for more than a decade even before the Great Renumbering. This image appeared on the cover of the Division of Highways magazine, showing a newly completed section of freeway in San Clemente, sporting shields for both Interstate 5 and US 101. So, in the interest of one road equals one route, US 101 was removed. The routing of Interstate 5 diverged from US 101 at the new East Los Angeles interchange just a couple of miles south of Union Station, and that left an interesting oddity in the area. When the freeways in the downtown area were built in the 1950s, the name of the freeway south of the stack was the Santa Ana Freeway, and north of there it was the Hollywood Freeway, but both of them were a part of US 101. It's just that US 101 had two different names on either side of the stack. As Interstate 5 was added into the mix, in general it used the routing of the Santa Ana Freeway, but since the new interstate diverged from the route of US 101 just short of the stack, the northernmost portion of the Santa Ana Freeway retained its designation as US 101. So this means that through downtown LA, US 101 is still called the Santa Ana Freeway. While the Hollywood Freeway is widely regarded as being synonymous with US 101 and Interstate 5 is the Santa Ana Freeway, the southernmost 3 miles of US 101 are still part of the Santa Ana Freeway. Aside from Southern California, there was one more place where US 101 was impacted by the Great Renumbering, and that was up here on the San Francisco Peninsula. The route didn't get shortened like it did in LA, but it did get moved. Now, US 101 presented an interesting exhibition of two very different approaches to numbering of the freeways in California in the 1950s. In Southern California, US 101 used the freeways as they were constructed, while up in the Bay Area, US 101 remained on its surface street routes. The Bayshore Freeway carried the designation of Bypass 101, and the primary route for US 101 remained on El Camino Real. Now, there is a longer, more complicated history because early on in the freeway era, the designation of bypass was used in Southern California too, but it didn't take long for them to begin using the freeways as the mainline route. So I'm not sure why the same scenario was handled so differently within the same state, but the Great Renumbering would finally rectify it and make it more consistent. Here's the map from 1963, just before the Great Renumbering, and you can see that the Bayshore Freeway here is marked as Bypass 101, while the real 101 is still over here on El Camino Real. And then here's the San Jose inset from the same map, showing the same pattern. To resolve this, the routing for US 101 was moved to the freeway, and the surface street routing on El Camino Real just became State Route 82. Now, I'm not counting this change in the alignment as part of the truncation mileage for US 101, because it was mostly a relatively even exchange. So, in 1964, US 101 lost only its southernmost 135 miles. I want to thank you for watching this episode. I'll tell you that this project is somewhat of a labor of love for me, so it takes a while for me to research, script, and produce each episode. But I'll confess that this episode was delayed further by the ongoing federal government shutdown. I usually use the old USGS topographic maps for route research and as public domain map images, but those maps have been unavailable for a month now. At first I was going to wait it out, but eventually I decided that I needed to get moving and use different map sources. I'm kind of indignant that my road history research is deemed non-essential by the federal government. In any case, thank you for your patience. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you would click on the thumbs up. That's how YouTube decides if it should share the video with more people who might be interested in things like this. And if you enjoy the content on this old road, I'd be honored to have you as a subscriber.